Part 3. Directions. In this part, you will hear 3 talks or lectures. The talks or lectures will not be repeated. There are 5 questions for each talk or lecture. For each question, choose the right answer, A, B, C, or D. Then on the answer sheet, find the number of the question and fill in the space that corresponds to the letter of the answer you have chosen. Questions 21 to 25.
Listen to part of a lecture in a psychology class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25.
So, we've been talking about human cognitive and social development. Now, I'd like to move along to discuss Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a very influential theory that has been widely applied both inside and outside the field of psychology in education, social work, and even criminal justice. Now, Maslow began his career studying the behavior of monkeys, and one of the most interesting things he noticed was that some of the monkeys' needs took precedence over others. Some needs appeared to be more important. For example, if the monkeys were both hungry and thirsty, they would seek water before food. See, you can only live for a few days without water, but food is still important. You still have to eat, but the need for water is stronger. The monkeys also needed to play to get exercise, but the needs for food and water were more pressing. Out of his observations of monkeys and later observation of people, Maslow developed his ideas into the now famous hierarchy of human needs. Let's take a look at each layer of these needs in greater detail. As the monkey story illustrates, the first layer, the physiological needs, is the foundation, the needs that must be met first. Unless you get enough oxygen, water, protein, salt, sugar, vitamins, and minerals, and unless you maintain a healthy pH balance, body temperature, and so on, you won't live long enough to worry about very many other needs. Moving on, the second layer of needs is, the need for safety and security. So let's say you meet all your physiological needs. Soon, you'll probably start thinking about finding stability and protection, developing structure, creating order, those kinds of things. Defined negatively, when you're no longer hungry and thirsty, fears and anxieties are your next concern. You want to find a safe neighborhood, job security, a retirement plan, and so on. Meet these needs, and you'll focus on the needs for love and belonging, which is the third level in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You have your food, your comfortable shelter, your job security, and you begin to feel the need for friends, a partner, a sense of community even. If you don't meet these needs, you'll grow susceptible to loneliness and social anxieties, a major problem in modern urban societies, alienation. There are socially acceptable ways to meet these needs, getting married, joining a club or church, and less socially acceptable ways, like joining a gang or getting involved in a drug culture. Now we're at the fourth level, esteem, needs, and here, pay attention, Maslow notes 2 subsets. The lower one is the need for respect from others, status, fame, glory, recognition. Get the idea? The higher form involves the need for self-respect, confidence, achievement, freedom even. Now, this stratification of esteem needs is often debated, though I think Maslow had it right in the first place. Self-respect is the higher form. Unlike the respect of others, and we all know how fickle that is, once you gain self-respect, it's a lot harder to lose. Fail to meet your esteem needs, and you're a candidate for some significant psychological problems. Maslow didn't believe humans could meet all 4 levels of their needs and just stop and be content. They would continuously need to grow, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. This is what he refers to as self-actualization, the fifth level. Few people meet all four preceding levels of their needs, so Maslow had less of an observable basis to define what self-actualization meant. And let's face it, this level is also the most abstract, the hardest to pin down. He did point out that self-actualized individuals, at least the ones he observed, tended to be autonomous, not overly concerned about social norms, yet at the same time had a strong sense of ethics and concern for the human species. They demonstrate a non-hostile sense of humor as well as a sense of humility and respect for others. They tended to be very creative, inventive people. One thing educators, for example, have taken from Maslow's theory is the importance of making sure children have their most basic needs met as forming an important foundation on which to teach them not only knowledge, but also the values of self-respect and respect for others. Let's take a brief look at how this is done, okay?
What is the lecture mainly about?
According to the professor, what did Maslow realize from studying monkeys? According to the professor, which of the following is a feature of self-actualized individuals? Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
Now we're at the fourth level, esteem, needs, and here, pay attention, Maslow notes two subsets. The lower one is the need for respect from others, status, fame, glory, recognition. Get the idea?
Why does the professor say this?
Status, fame, glory, recognition. Get the idea?
What would the professor most likely talk about next?
Questions 26 to 30.
Listen to part of a lecture in a history class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 26 to 30.
Today we're going to talk about what spices meant to medieval Europeans, what symbolic value they had. Most of you never give much thought to the salt and pepper in the cafeteria, or the supermarket, or a restaurant, am I right? They're inexpensive, readily available, pretty boring you might say, both of them. We tend to think of salt and pepper as a pair, but they actually have very dissimilar histories, different journeys that led them to end up on our dinner tables. First, let's look at salt. In moderation, it is an essential part of a healthy diet, but it's so common nowadays we wouldn't consider it valuable. The attitude was different in, say, some kingdoms of Africa that maintained ancient salt trading routes across the Sahara Desert, some of which still exist today. Of course, people need some in their diet, but it was valuable mostly because it was one of the few substances known to keep foods from spoiling quickly. Our word salary comes from the Roman practice of paying soldiers partly in salt rather than entirely in money. But, back to my point, trying to lay out some symbolism for you here. While medieval Europeans would have considered salt a very necessary substance, They also considered it very mundane, nothing special, sort of like how we see it today. Now, pepper was the exact opposite. Medieval Europeans developed quite a powerful taste for pepper and other spices like cinnamon and nutmeg. Sure, you could use pepper or nutmeg or cinnamon to season your food, but they're not essential to the diet like salt. Some people believe that these spices were important for preserving food or even flavoring food that was no longer fresh. Well, that's not such a good explanation for the popularity of these spices, as medieval Europeans already had salt and plenty of native herbs to flavor or preserve food. Does anyone have any ideas why pepper and other spices might have been so popular? How about you, Diane?
Maybe they taste better?
Sort of. You're headed in the right direction. I mean, they were more desirable and taste may have been one factor, but something that's strange or different or exotic might be more interesting, right? And so, it was with pepper and other such spices like cinnamon, ginger, cardamom.
Sorry, Professor, but how exactly could pepper be exotic?
Good question. See, they didn't call this time period the Dark Ages for nothing. Travel and commerce across long distances were dangerous and rare. Your average European was generally not in contact with anyone outside his or her local world, say within a 10-mile radius or so, except through the church. But that's a whole different issue that we're going to bypass for the moment. Now where was I? Oh yes, so pepper came mainly from India and cinnamon from Ceylon, what we now call Sri Lanka. But very few medieval Europeans had the slightest idea where they came from. All they knew was that merchants could buy spices from Arabs in Egypt. Where the Arabs got them from was a mystery.
So, the spices were valuable just because they came from far away?
Yes, right, but even more than that, and this is what I want you to get out of our discussion today, because spices were rare, pretty much only purchased by the upper classes, nobility, not by the masses. There's no way you'd find pepper on a table in a medieval university dining hall, and if you did, you wouldn't take it for granted. You'd feel pretty special eating it. Because they came from so far off, well, the disconnected Europeans weren't quite sure where a lot of them came from. Spices were actually thought to have their origins in paradise.
So people actually believed spices came from heaven?
Well, not exactly what we think of as heaven today. In the worldview of medieval Europeans, paradise was some physical place on earth, someplace far off and unknown, but real. That's what gave exotic spices their symbolic value. Salt, like salt today, was available to all, a very democratic item, you might say. Pepper, cinnamon, and so on were reserved exclusively for the aristocrats, kings, queens, ruling nobility. Spices were more than useful. They set the rulers apart from their subjects and suggested that they, the higher classes, were closer to paradise than the commoners.
What is the lecture mainly about? According to the professor, why was salt so valuable to early peoples?
According to the professor, Europeans probably did not Why does the professor mention that most Europeans in the Dark Ages only knew about the world within a 10-mile radius of their homes? Listen again to part of the lecture. Then answer the question.
Travel and commerce across long distances were dangerous and rare. Your average European was generally not in contact with anyone outside his or her local world, say within a 10-mile radius or so, except through the church. But that's a whole different issue that we're going to bypass for the moment.
Number 18. Why does the professor say this?
But that's a whole different issue that we're going to bypass for the moment.
Questions 31 to 35.
Now listen to part of a talk in an art history class.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 35.
So, folks, this evening I want to move on from our previous discussion of Romanesque architecture to the new forms that emerged beginning in the 11th century, which came to be known as Gothic architecture. As you'll likely recall, Romanesque architecture mainly consisted of a return, after about a 600-year break, to using Roman forms and adapting them for the creation of a new generation of monumental structures. We talked about the development of arches, barrel vaults, and in particular, the rebirth of monumental sculpture, specifically as seen in the great portals that were built in the 11th and 12th centuries. Now then, at the end of the 12th century, we also began to see the emergence of a new architectural style, Gothic. So, I hope all of you read the assigned chapters, so maybe someone could tell us about a few of the key features of Gothic architecture?
Well, I seem to remember that the Gothic style emphasizes verticality, rising high and light, and that they used, let me just grab my notes here, huge glass windows, skeletal structures, pointed arches, high vaults, and pointed spires. I think there were a few other features.
Yeah, I remember the gargoyles, you know, those monster statues, and they also had the flying buttresses, right?
That's right. I'm glad you brought up the pointed arch and the flying buttress, two very important innovations. As you may recall in the reading, the pointed arch allowed for tall windows, often made of intricate stained glass designs. You can see some of the most colorful and interesting examples at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. I think there's a picture of it in your book, actually. Right, then, the pointed arch, unlike the low, round Romanesque arch, allowed for tall windows and thus more light to enter than was possible in the older Romanesque churches and cathedrals. With the taller arches and colored stained glass windows, brighter, more magnificent spaces could be created. The Gothic cathedrals are quite bold in their aspirations to soar to greater heights, into the heavens. So next we have the flying buttress, the second feature of Gothic style that I want to talk about today. One that was important to the full development of the Gothic cathedrals. Does anyone have an idea of why that might be?
Maybe they allowed the sculptors to position figures like the gargoyles and others high above, but so that people on the ground could still see them.
No, I don't think that's quite it. The book mentioned something about a buttress being a means of support, but I think that has to do with supporting walls, not sculptures.
That's true. Earlier churches, even castles and Roman public buildings, used buttresses to support thick walls. So the flying buttress evolved from an existing form, and it allowed cathedrals to be built taller by providing support for higher vaulted ceilings. Its function was to transmit the thrust, the outward force and weight of a roof or a vault across an intervening space to a buttress on the outside of the building. By using flying buttresses, an architect could place windows or other openings in load-bearing walls, the walls that support the weight of the roof, which would allow more light to enter the building. Also, cathedrals could now soar to even greater heights, dizzying heights. For instance, if you look at the Ulm Cathedral in Germany, It rises to 530 feet, including the spire, another feature of Gothic style that I believe was mentioned in your book. Now, 530 feet, that's pretty tall. We're talking taller than the first modern skyscrapers, and built without the use of a steel skeleton or modern machinery.
So it was just made of stone?
For the most part, structures built in the Gothic style, originally that is, there are modern copies, Gothic revival we call it. For the most part, Gothic structures of the Middle Ages were built entirely of carved stone blocks cemented together. Wood frames were used during construction and for some of the final decorative work, but rarely for structural purposes. And that brings me to the third feature I want to talk about, vaults. Remember the Romanesque vaults?
Yeah, I think they had the rounded low vaults and then the longer barrel vault, and they had the broad, stout columns.
Exactly. With the pointed arch and the flying buttress, among other changes that we'll get to, builders could create higher vaulted ceilings that were more open, more airy. Unlike the round Romanesque arch, the pointed arch distributed weight downward more effectively, thus allowing for narrower columns and more open vaulted areas, again, letting in more light and air throughout the building. Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer. What is the talk mainly about? By mentioning Romanesque architecture, the professor According to the talk, impressive cathedral windows were made possible by the use of The lecturer notes that the Cathedral of Ulm is remarkably Listen again to part of the talk. Then answer the question. For the most part, structures built in the Gothic style, originally that is, there are modern copies, Gothic revival we call it. For the most part, Gothic structures of the Middle Ages were built entirely of carved stone blocks cemented together. Why does the professor say this? Originally, that is, there are modern copies, Gothic revival we call it.
That is the end of part 3. Now, you will have 7 minutes to transfer your answers to an answer sheet.